Hi, my name is Trinity Lee, and for my theater presentation, I will be presenting on Commedia dell'arte. Next slide, please. So in this first section of the presentation, I'll be explaining what Commedia dell'arte is and the influences it's had on other forms of theater and its significance in the context of theater. Okay, so what is Commedia dell'arte? So according to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it is a theatrical form characterized by improvised dialogue and a cast of colorful stock characters that emerged in northern Italy in the 15th century and rapidly gained popularity throughout Europe. And next slide, please. So Commedia dell'arte translates literally to comedy of the profession or comedy of art. And it's actually an improvised style of theater, which means that the dialogue is not scripted, dialogue is not planned, but characters, styles, and scenarios are planned ahead of time. And in this genre, there isn't necessarily a playwright or a script that falls under it, but instead it's more of a style of theater. A myriad of shows can be performed in the style of Commedia dell'arte, and it has various technical conventions and characteristics. So it utilizes stock characters or commonly used archetypes. So what makes Commedia dell'arte special is that it uses its own sets of stock characters. Additionally, subject matter of shows performed in this style often pertain to current events or prevalent topics wherever it was being performed. And an important part of the tradition is that it was often performed by traveling troupes. So it wasn't really in a playhouse or in a conventional theater. It often happened on the streets or in temporary stages. And other important characteristics are the lazzi, which is a humorous interruption given always to the most expert and popular actors. And it was basically either acting or even acrobatics, juggling, any sort of comedic physical action. And there are also elaborate masks which were specific to each of the characters, and then there were themes and situations that were chiefly concerned with love intrigues, which were carried out by the innamorati. Next slide. So Commedia dell'arte originated in Italy in the 16th century, and according to some, as early as the 14th century. And during this time, Italy was experiencing the peak of its Renaissance era. And this makes Commedia dell'arte a product of the Renaissance, which means that it spread across Europe very quickly, just like most of the other ideas of the Renaissance did. Continue. Okay, so Commedia dell'arte is probably the most famous theater tradition that you've never heard of. It was accredited with several firsts for European theater, including the first incorporated theater company and the first inclusion of actresses. In addition to this, Commedia dell'arte served as a chief influence on French farce, which developed as the French adapted the style of theater of touring commedia troupes, as well as pantomime, vaudeville, opera, contemporary musical theater, and even renowned playwrights such as Shakespeare and Moliere. The influence of Commedia dell'arte is even more far-reaching than this, including modern comedy, such as Modern Family, and even animated shows like Futurama and movies like The Lion King. So, as I said before, Commedia dell'arte is one of the most influential forms of theater. In addition to its impact on the aforementioned genres and traditions, it has influenced some of the greatest authors and playwrights in history. Some playwrights whose works show influences from the Commedia dell'arte are Machiavelli with his 1524 satirical play La Mandragola, or The Mandrake, and Ariosto's La Lena, and Moliere with works like The Trickeries of Scotland. The tradition was also notably influential to Shakespeare, which can be seen in several of his works, including The Tempest and The Taming of the Shrew. According to the Franklin University paper entitled Commedia dell'arte Influences on Shakespearean Plays, The Tempest, Love Labour's Lost, and The Taming of the Shrew, Shakespeare incorporates prominent features of Commedia dell'arte in several of his works by basing characters on stock characters and embracing Italian pastoral themes. Playwrights like Machiavelli, who notably used plays and literature to make social commentary, used these stock characters in order to portray social norms and to give his commentary on what was happening in political stages and social stages at the time. Next. So, like I said before, Commedia dell'arte even influences what we consider modern comedy, and there are animated movies like The Lion King, which show evidence of certain stock characters like the Magnifico, which is portrayed as either the Pantalone or the Doctor, which will be explored a little bit more later on in the presentation. And in Modern Family, Jay, a character who is older and who chases after younger women, as his wife is about 20 years younger than him, is also a Magnifico. Okay, so in this section, I will be talking about history of Commedia dell'arte, as well as its social influences. Okay, so as mentioned earlier in the presentation, Commedia dell'arte troupes often performed in the streets and on temporary stages, which means that entertainment was for the common man. However, there were also troupes that performed in royal courts, and this was in France, Germany, and all across Europe. In this way, Commedia really bridged a gap between the forms of theater enjoyed by various classes in the 16th to 18th century European society. Additionally, this form of theater came at a time in which comedies barely scratched the surface of absurdism. There wasn't really anything non-stiff about Italian comedy at the time, and Commedia dell'arte really bridged that gap between what we now consider comedy and ancient comedy. So Commedia was started as a combination of literary societies and street performers, which allowed for the wide range of social classes to be portrayed artfully instead of it seeming like someone from the opposite end of the spectrum was simply mocking or intimidating them. And additionally, actors weren't simply performers, they were able to write, edit, and direct, which made them truly a part of each facet of the theatrical experience. And the act of performing Commedia dell'arte was a social one, as the actors and actresses had to understand their audience, know about their background, and the current events of the region or city in which they were performing, as well as pay close attention to the sense of humor of the audience and what they responded to. Okay, so in this section, I'm going to be talking about the performance conventions of Commedia dell'arte and how Commedia was executed. Next slide. Okay, so in the essay on the tradition, the Met explains that performances were based on set schema or scenarios that were often a familiar story upon which the actors improvised their dialogue. Thus, actors were at liberty to tailor a performance to their audience, allowing for sly commentary on current politics and body humor that otherwise would be censored. So, the improv employed in Commedia dell'arte was a much more tactful and complex form of what we think of as improv. So the characters and their defining qualities, major plot points, settings, and things like this were already planned before a show was produced or performed. And then actors who really had to understand the meaning of their stock character and some of the traditions of that specific character would come up with dialogue on the spot, which shows truly how artful and how involved the Commedia actors were, not only in their specific form of theater, but the overall act of producing a work of theater. So the actors and companies would know well what kind of character they were playing, as well as the context in which the play was being played. But they had to create dialogue themselves, which really shows how great an understanding these players had to have. Thank you. Okay. So the action was improvised, but the plot was planned. And there were certain features such as the Lazzi, which I mentioned earlier, that were planned. And no scene was more than 3 minutes long. Okay, so stock characters are tropes or archetypes, like I said before, that are used as the basis for the characters in a plot. These archetypes all have distinct traits and personality flaws, even distinct appearances. And some modern examples of what we would know as archetypes or stock characters would be things such as the mean girl or the awkward dad in a movie. And Commedia dell'arte employs a specific set of stock characters, including the Magnifico, the first actor or actress, the Pantalone and the Doctor, Columbina, Bragella, Harlequino, Captain, and Zani, which occur throughout the tradition. So all of these characters had costumes, gestures, and stage business that were specific to them and them only. And they also had an entire repertoire of phrases that they would use across all productions. And they also had sayings, certain exits, and things like this that were attributed to their specific stock character. Okay, so there is a hierarchy, if you notice the structure of this diagram, which shows all of the stock characters involved in Commedia dell'arte. And this style of theater is reliant on drawing from social norms, cues, and exaggerating the types of people that were present all across Italy. Another characteristic of the hierarchy is that there is definitely an understanding of age, and this shows that the esteemed characters tend to be the older ones, the Doctor, Pantalone, which are both Magnifico characters. And characters like Zani and Harlequino are much more simple-minded and younger. This aspect of the tradition shows that, as in most cultures, Italian culture values the wisdom that comes with age and believes in the esteem of elders. Keep in mind that these are not the names of the characters, but instead their archetypes. Okay, so the Magnifico usually had an eagle-like mask, which you can see in this drawing right here, and they were usually a wealthy politician or city leader, and they had a lot of esteem. Like I said before, this is either the Doctor or the Pantalone, and they tended to chase after younger women, they tended to look down on others, and things like this. Next slide. Okay, so the Pantalone. He had a form-fitting mask with a large nose and bushy eyebrows that were attached to the mask. He, like I said before, was wealthy and esteemed, chased after young women. And the thing about the Pantalone was that he was a mean, intrusive kind of character. He was intimidating in his negative demeanor, and an example of the Pantalone in a modern production would be Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. Next slide. Okay, so the first actor and actress, or the innamorati, were basically the only characters in a commedia production that didn't wear masks. And this was because they were probably part of the central theme of the show, which revolved around their quest for love. So they provided the kind of emotional extremes in a commedia production. They were happiest and they were the saddest. They lead with their arms and shoulders in their movements, and they're supremely focused on achieving their romantic interests. And as such, they're kind of stupid, and most of their relationships revolve around their goal or their quest to achieve their romantic interests. Next slide. Okay, so the Zani was one of the key integral characters in a commedia production. The Zani was always highly animated and waving his arms and gesticulating with his hands, and always spoke in a coarse manner. They were very acrobatic characters, and they displayed their roots and were constantly ravenously hungry. But in their coarseness, they also introduced mirth into the theater, and the typical features of the Zani were that they were poor, desperate, ignorant, very hungry. And as such, they always sought out food. They always sought out very basic and elementary things. And they always moved in awkward manners, and here is an example of how the Zani would walk. Next slide. Okay, so the captain was another stock character. He usually had a half mask that had a slight expression of fear. So the captain was very masculine, or at least portrayed a masculine energy with a lot of bravado. However, they were always pretty cowardly when it came down to actually displaying their strength. So they were usually Spanish, dressed to kill or dressed like a soldier. They wore a hat with boots and a sword, which was an integral part of their costume. They would always speak of their achievements when it came to war and fighting, but never really displayed them. Next slide. So Il Dottore, or the doctor, had a 1/3 mask, and they also had bushy eyebrows with a pretty large nose. And as I said before, this is one of the Magnifico characters. The doctor was the second oldest man next to the Pantalone, and they weren't always a doctor. Think of them more as an academic or a learned person. Usually a lawyer or an astrologer, some sort of academic. And he usually was from the region of Bologna, and sometimes he represented an absent-minded pedant quoting Latin at inappropriate times or misquoting things. And they were supposed to be of superior intellect, but as I said before, they often made common mistakes and had pitfalls that any of us would have. Very pseudo-intelligent and ignorant, but tries their best to sound smart. and they had a very mock-imposing posture. They leaned forward as they spoke, and they tried to demean others with their intellect. The doctor character was normally used in commedia dell'arte plays to put a break in the action with empty, prefabricated, and supposedly erudite monologues. And here's an example of how the doctor would walk. Next slide. Okay, so the Columbina was another very integral stock character. They were the female counterpart of the Arlecchino, or the Harlequin. So the Columbina was a clever female servant who always had something to say, always had gossip, and was usually one of the smarter characters in the play. And by smart, I mean clever. She definitely used wit and outsmarted a lot of the other characters in the show, and tended to indirectly cause the Pantalone physical harm or outwit the Harlequin. They were a servant character, which means that they fell under the guise of Azani, and she was more refined in her mannerisms, but at the same time, she was a comedic character, showing that she sort of bridged the gap between the higher classes represented in commedia dell'arte shows and the lower classes represented. She was usually, like I said, the companion or lover of the Arlecchino, and she was also very colorfully dressed, just as the Harlequino was, and she was a soubrette, which is a comedy character who's vain, girlish, mischievous, lighthearted, and gossipy. She was usually very flirtatious, and an example of the Columbina would be Dorian in Moliere's Tartuffe. Next slide. Okay, so the Harlequin. This is another very influential character that is seen in a lot of modern shows and what we think of as classics throughout theater. So the Harlequin, or the Arlecchino, is very witty and charming, but also very clown-like and sometimes simple-minded. And as a part of this act, the Arlecchino used a slapstick, which became very prominent in other forms of comedy later on in history. They play the role of a faithful servant, but can be sometimes very scheming to achieve their own desires and their own goals. And they're really energetic, and just like the Zani, they're very acrobatic in their movements, and they lead with their nose when they move. So the Arlecchino mask is usually very pug-like and has a very prominent nose for this reason. Next slide. Okay, so I already did my performance conventions with my movements. Next slide. Okay, so my personal impact. I think this research project has allowed me to delve into a form of theater that is very influential in much of the work that, as a high school actress, I interact with. This has impacted me by allowing me to learn the importance of physicality in portraying various comedic characters and how the physicality can be parlayed into the development of a particular character. I've also been able to gain an understanding of how various people within a society can influence and be drawn on for the creation of a character. This tradition's specific use of exaggerated and often absurd stock characters has allowed me to explore the effect of absurdity in the physical aspects of acting and how this improves the production of a play, even with non-absurd dialogue. Some questions that have arisen from this research are, what are the moral and ethical repercussions of using stereotypes in theater? Is improvisational theater more successful in portraying themes and messages when more dependent on physicality or dialogue? And in what ways do very socially oriented European traditions like this one relate to non-Western traditions? And are there any overlap? Lastly, the study has allowed me to learn how to approach a task both creatively and methodically, both in learning about the production of a commedia show and my own research. I've discovered that creativity and curiosity essentially work together and both allow the other to be strengthened.